So let's get going. So today's webinar, entitled Post-Pandemic Biopharma Environment and Three Major Trends in the US and Europe. Is the industry prepared? It's presented today by Stelios, who provides expert insights as to how the industry needs to adapt in a post-pandemic environment. And there certainly has been shockwaves going through the industry. And I think, as Stelios will show you today, those shockwaves will continue for at least a couple of years. Just to give you a bit of background, Stelios brings over 30 years of experience in life sciences, having most recently served as a regional vice president at a global pharmaceutical company. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, or we can obviously address them at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to Stelios.
Mike, thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon or good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure presenting to this team. So as Mike said, I was asked to present on some of the major trends for the biopharma industry in the US and Europe. So first, I looked at the microenvironment, the forces in the microenvironment that really are going to shape the markets, the EU and US markets, the major markets for the biopharma industry. And I think it's common knowledge that we're going through some very significant global economic, public health, and demographic changes globally that have actually forced governments, both in the US and in Europe, to legislate major reforms in relation to regulatory pricing, competition, and access laws. And these will really shape the market going forward and for the rest of the decades. Of course, part of the picture is COVID, the pandemic, and the deep and long-lasting impacts it has left on healthcare and the pharma business in general across multiple areas: economics, access to healthcare professionals, patient journey, employment, ways of working. I think we're all familiar with these changes, but maybe some of them had started already before the pandemic, but they were definitely amplified and accelerated post-COVID. And of course, as we discussed in the previous webcast, we have things like artificial intelligence, but in general, digital technology, social media, virtual technology that have really triggered a major change in the way we're working in the pharma business. So if we're focusing on the pharma market, on the biopharma market in the US and Europe, I think you can easily call out three trends that will really have overwhelming impact on the pharma business and the way we're doing business and the way we're launching products in the pharma industry. So I picked out these three trends because I think from a revenue and profitability point of view are going to have, and structurally as well, are going to have the biggest impact on biopharma, both in the US and in Europe. So the first one is really the launch environment and the launch paradigm for new blockbuster pharmaceuticals. And most research and many analysts highlight that actually the paradigm is shifting really quickly because of some of the pressures and trends I mentioned before. And then the other two are really legislative changes, major legislative changes that are going to have very significant impact on pharmaceutical pricing, access, and many other areas as well. So this Inflation Reduction Act that was introduced last August, and also the European HTA and access integration. So starting off with the post-COVID launch environment, research has shown that actually post-COVID, the pathway to diagnosis and treatment has become lengthier, leakier, and more complex. And that means that for smaller organizations or newer companies, launching new medicines in the US and in Europe is way more complex and way more difficult and challenging that was in the past. And we have seen that actually the launch trajectory for new products post-COVID is not as good as it used to be. This is what the research shows so far. Another major trend related to this overall change in the launch environment is actually reduced access of pharma to HCPs, which has an impact on the launch trajectory. So research shows that most clinicians believe that this trend that started off with COVID is here to stay. So their projection, the forecast is that actually this reduction in face-to-face interactions with HCPs is not temporary, but is here to stay with us, which means that, you know, companies need to find other ways, and they are working on this, of course, and have made huge progress in terms of interacting with clinicians. And again, you know, in terms of the product development and launch paradigm, you know, so far in immunology, major therapeutic areas, the pipeline in the product approach with sequenced indication launches with the same asset, the same product, was really the pharma paradigm for new product development and launches. But as we will see later, actually, this model is not sustainable anymore in the context of the recent legislative changes, both in the US and in Europe. And of course, you know, we have, given the geopolitical changes and issues and challenges on top of what COVID brought to us, we have massive inflation and cost containment pressures. And that's both on the government side, where they're trying to really roll back, you know, some of the increase in healthcare expenses that took place during COVID, but also in terms of the pharma industry, you know, trying to address challenges like the increased cost of goods, the increased cost of research because of the inflationary pressures, you know, that started to appear after the COVID period. So these are really big pressures that weigh on the pharma industry and influence the way they're structured and the way companies are spending their money. Another related issue here is the realization of the US government and European governments that actually, in the current context of threat of pandemics, but also geopolitical threats, it's probably not wise to solely rely on overseas manufacturing, right? So we see a trend for reshoring of pharma manufacturing, which also means additional pressure on the cost of manufacturing as well. And therefore, you know, all these cost pressures, you know, will spill over to other areas like commercial and promotion and the structure of global pharma companies. So moving on to trend number 2, and I think that's probably the biggest threat for the pharma industry in terms of size, you know, in terms of potential impacts on the revenues and the profitability. So used to be the most liberal market in terms of pharmaceutical pricing. But in recent years, there has been a bipartisan pressure to really get a handle on the increasing cost of prices pharmaceuticals. And eventually, you know, Joe Biden's administration passed new legislation whereby they're introducing direct price negotiations for Medicare Part D drugs. So this is the first time in the history of this market where the government essentially will be able to negotiate pharmaceutical prices at the national level. So not just the individual health plans, but at the national level. So the legislation, which is already effective essentially, and will start being implemented properly as of next year, essentially says that once you are 9 years in the market, if you're a small molecule, or 13 years if you're a biologic, then you will need to negotiate your prices. And research has shown that actually this is going to have a 25% cumulative net revenue impact, 4% if you do it in terms of net, if you calculate the net present value of these impacts on the lead indications of these pharmaceuticals, of these drugs that will be actually selected to be initially negotiated. So initially they will look at the list of the 100 most expensive drugs from a total $120 billion budget, which is the Medicare Part D budget. And then they will select next year 10 drugs, and then they will implement these negotiations for these drugs initially, and gradually they will keep adding new medicines into these negotiations. And already I think there are 4 pharma companies suing the government to really challenge the introduction of these legislative changes, because obviously the impact is going to be huge. But that means really that the current launch paradigm, especially in oncology and immunology, whereby you first launch, a small indication, highly experienced patients, for example, treatment experienced patients, and then you gradually start expanding until you reach your bigger indications in the second or third or fourth or fifth year. This launch paradigm is not sustainable anymore, may not be sustainable anymore, because by the time you launch your biggest indication, you're probably already 5-6 years into the launch. So in the 9th year, or close to that, you will have to start negotiating, and you are getting into almost a death spiral with the price negotiations. So companies with different assets with the same mechanism of action, but different assets for different indications, so they don't get to this 9-year threshold, too quickly. There are other changes as well. For example, on an annual basis, you will only be allowed to increase your prices in the first 9 years at a rate lower than the inflation. And if you apply higher increases, then you will need to give rebates back to the government. So major changes with huge impacts in the US. But then if we move across the pond to the EU, I think we're all familiar with this issue of fragmentation in the EU, right? And the multiple HTA procedures and the different requirements in terms of data to be able to evaluate and assess the clinical efficacy and cost effectiveness of your products in the different markets in the EU. So this is indeed an issue in Europe, both for the patients but also for the industry. And that's why the EU had been negotiating for a number of years with FPA, the industry, ways to really harmonize some of these procedures and in a way equalize the access of patients regardless of which country they are in, in terms of new medicines. So if we look at the data, FPA research has shown that delays in reimbursement and disparity as well across the countries has deteriorated over the last few years. So you have a range of like 133 days in Germany to get access to a new medicine, all the way up to 900 days essentially in Romania. And that in a single market, that's not really acceptable from the EU point of view. And that's why, in January 2022, they introduced a new regulation for health technology assessments. This is the first step for harmonization of HTAs across Europe. Essentially, they introduced the joint clinical assessments, right, whereby it will be mandatory for the industry to actually follow this process and file a joint clinical assessment report for every new medicine they're launching in the EU. Unfortunately, that will not eliminate the would not get rid of the local assessments, right? So that was the effort during the negotiations. The main effort of the industry was to really have this joint clinical assessment replacing all national processes, but that's not going to happen. And essentially, that means that you're introducing a new process, a new step, which is going to be fast, because they have some really tight timelines to produce the assessment report. But it doesn't mean that countries will not they would not continue to mandate the local assessments as well. And then probably an even bigger change is something that is coming in the future shortly. So the Commission has proposed a number of major reforms in terms of access harmonization. And one of the impacts, there is a positive impact in these proposals that will be implemented during these decades. For example, the acceleration of the marketing authorization process, that will almost halve the time that it takes from submission to EMA approval based on the proposals. But at the same time, they're introducing incentives and counter incentives that will actually force pharmaceutical companies to launch in every single EU, to provide access in every single market in the EU within the first 2 years of launch. And if they don't do so, then it means that your data exclusivity period, right? So your minimum period of regulatory protection will be reduced by 2 years. So this 20% reduction from 10 years to 8 years. Again, there was a strong reaction from the industry. You can read statements from CEOs and FPA representatives that this is going to have exactly the opposite effects on access to medicines, and it's going to harm pharmaceutical innovation in Europe. But nevertheless, it's a trend, a legislative change that is going to have a major impact on the way companies are launching in Europe, and the way they're sequencing indications or choosing which markets are launching and sequencing markets geographically as well. So all this will probably change drastically because of these legislative changes. Otherwise, the companies will bear a very significant revenue impact. So that's the trend I want to discuss today. And I think, summarizing, I would say that the industry is not fully prepared, in my opinion, to address these challenges. There is a lot of work to be done to be able to deal with these changes. And of course, these changes will be a particular challenge for small or medium companies and even newcomers, new startups that want to do business in the US and in Europe, because the situation is going to be way more complex than it used to be in the past. And of course, the more experience you have to deal with this complexity, and the more resources you have to deal with this complexity, the better. But that's not the case for newer companies and startups. And maybe there will be more business, for third parties, who have the experience and the expertise to support these sort of smaller companies to successfully launch the products in these geographies. So that was all for me. And I'm happy to listen to your views or take any questions. Mike, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Stelios. A really insightful presentation. The industry is facing significant challenges, right? And I think companies will need to adjust to this. And you're right in assessing as well that, because it's more complex, there is going to be opportunities, obviously, for people to provide that support. But I'll hand the floor over to obviously everyone that's dialed in. So, any questions that anyone would like to ask Stelios? Anyone? Sorry, you might be on mute, by the way, if you're trying to speak. Sorry.
No, that would be more professional. I'll kick us off. I mean, that was really good, Stelios. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I learned some things. So thank you very much. I'm quite interested in the sort of the way the industry is going to engage its customer base to sell post COVID, and I wondered if you had a perspective on, given how COVID was a little while ago now. It doesn't seem like it, but actually it's quite a little while ago since we had COVID. I wondered if you had a perspective on how well the industry was doing to actually engage with trying to figure out new ways of engaging with its customers. I mean, I'll sort of give my own kind of perspective very quickly, which is I don't think very well at all. It seems to sort of have buried its head in the sand and almost sort of run away, and seems to be sort of reluctantly kind of entertaining that there might even be an issue. But I mean, that's my own perspective. I don't know if you or others on the call had a view on that.
Yeah, I think at the time I was still active. I was running the region for my company, and I can say different companies adjusted at a different pace, and the ones that were able to utilize they were ready. They were already ready, to utilize digital technologies to get access to their customers. They did very, very well, and actually they gained market share versus their competitors who were not ready or familiar enough with these new technologies, right? Now, I have to say that some companies, including the big guys like Pfizer, they sort of went one step ahead, and they even abolished completely, sales teams, or they changed their roles completely. So they were really, really aggressive in terms of changing the way they were promoting. I started in this business, by being a sales rep, and I know that in certain markets, it's very difficult to replace the face-to-face interactions, the effectiveness of face-to-face interactions with a digital tool. I think you need to have a portfolio of skills to really approach. I don't think you can be successful without really excelling in digital detailing and passing your information digitally to clinicians, or utilizing tools like artificial intelligence to really formulate your strategies. But equally, I don't think, at least in certain cultures and in certain markets, equally, I don't think you can be successful unless you have a really strong sales force, maybe a smaller one. Yeah, fine, because clinicians are expecting to have less interactions face-to-face. You have to respect that, right? Maybe smaller teams, but a good sales team will always give you a competitive edge, I think, at least for this decade. I don't know what's going to happen 20 years from now, but at least for now.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stelios.
Thank you.
Anybody got any other questions?
Stelios, your last slide was about fragmentation. HTA is messy. We know this is already an issue because but thinking about, we got Tom Gorlick on the line from the US, and just thinking about US biotech coming to Europe, is there an opportunity for us? Most people on this line are solo contractors. I know we're all affiliated into Phraktion, but what's the opportunity for us where we've got complexity coming? Is this actually mean that the general agencies are going to fight a struggle? Is this a soft spot for us to aim at because we can keep up with the changes? I mean, just think of it that way. What can we do about it?
Yeah, look, to be honest, if there was a true harmonization, and it's going to happen eventually, if that meant that you had like a European, that would be hugely attractive to US biotechs, right? That are sitting on the fence at the moment, and or they go back and forth, in terms of the decision to come to Europe. and that would really increase the demand for services, because in any case, you know, even if they go direct and they establish their own presence in Europe, these are small structures, and in most cases they work with contractors and agencies, you know, to do anything really, from government affairs to market access and the rest, you know, because they don't have their own resources to do this. So I think a full harmonization would be a good thing for our business, you know, as consultants, our agencies and contractors, really attract all these companies, but we're not there yet. Now, on the other hand, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, is about making the decision to go to Europe. If they make the decision to go to Europe, that's good for us, right? If they're sitting on the fence because of the complexity, that's not good for us, I think, because, yeah, of course, complexity means they need more help, but it will only be a handful of those companies that will actually make the decision to come to Europe, right? Of course, there is an opportunity when it comes to distributors, right? Because, okay, you don't have to launch your product directly in Europe, but you can actually do it through distributors, or you can do it through partnerships, right? And that's another area where we could play a role, because, you know, we could help them identify the right partner, and then we can help facilitate, you know, this partnership, and it could be, you know, their representatives actually in this partnership in Europe, for example. But I think overall, we need to make Europe a more attractive place for US biotech to actually make the decision to seriously invest. That would give us more business, I think. So it's a good trend, this desire to harmonize everything. I think overall should be, okay, global companies may lose a little bit of margin, you know, because negotiating, for example, a single price gives leverage to the negotiator, right? But overall, you know, you will be targeting a bigger population, and you will get rid of all this fragmentation and complexity, which is really cost and delays, right? Yeah, so I think overall it's a good trend with a short-term pain, and it's good for us as well, because we'll have more customers from the US coming to Europe.
I suppose it's a bit of a circle, Stelios, because if you think, before HTA really took off, one of the first nations to get into it was obviously Germany and the UK, especially with NICE. And then with the SMC, there was a reference point. A NICE and SMC for many countries would take that as a surrogate for their own HTA process. What's happened now is they've caught up. So I suppose we're entering a position, it's a maturity situation, which means, as you say, it makes sense to now have everybody in the same place. One other question might be, in the intermediate period, something that I've heard is US biotechs coming in and only cherry picking and saying, for example, they'll only go top 5 or top 3. Again, I don't know if that's something else. In the intermediate period, before we get to harmonization, do we think we're going to see US biotechs, for example, just coming in and taking Germany, UK, and a selection of other larger companies? Because if you look at value distribution, we know that by the time you've got through Alpine Nordics at the top 5, the value left for the tail end is actually fairly small.
Yeah, I mean, look, but that would be even more difficult, because you have this counter incentive. You know, if you're not launching to the other markets within 2 years, then your data exclusivity period gets down to 8 years, right? And then you're losing your exclusivity in Europe, and then you have really, really low prices even in the bigger markets in Europe. So it makes it even more difficult to have this cherry picking strategy, to be honest. I mean, it's a real challenge, and I don't think the industry did a good job in terms of negotiating with EU Commission, because they did not get rid of the local processes, right? So they added the process, a centralized process, without getting rid of the national processes. That's the worst possible outcome, really.
Absolutely, because you're going to get squeezed. You're going to get squeezed at the harmonization level, right? And then you're going to get squeezed again when it goes down to country level. That's going to present some real challenges. Thank you, Paul. Any other questions? Okay, right. Fabulous.
I'll go in for one more bite.
Sorry, no, go on, Bruce. Yeah, go ahead.
So I mean, I'm my personal interest. I'm quite interested in how the pharma industry engages with the customer to, do its business at the coalface. Let's say I'm interested in, again, come back to this COVID thing. I wonder how much of an influence the COVID experience that we've been through will change the dynamic between how much we spend on medical affairs resources versus how much we spend on commercial resources. And I'm curious to see what other people think.
Yeah, I mean, if I can say, that trend was already in place even before COVID and got accelerated afterwards, so there were sort of a number of global big pharma, they were really shifting resources. They were even changing the name of the teams, right? So they say we get rid of sales teams, we get rid of medical teams, and we just have one team which does both, and it's sort of is quite far from the traditional sort of sales rep profile. But then that got accelerated afterwards because if I don't have access, then why do I need all these big sales teams, right? Maybe I need more medical scientists or hybrid roles, or I need more people in the office giving information or working on digital, for example. So what I saw personally in my competitors and generally companies in my therapeutic areas, they invested a lot in growing the digital marketing teams, right? Invested a lot on platforms that would allow them to have an efficient access to clinicians. But to be honest, if you measure the efficacy of these tools as they currently stand, because of course they're evolving, it's not great. I mean, the biggest problem we had during COVID was that all these clinicians, they were bombarded by all sorts of different digital platforms that you had to install on your computer to be able then to talk to the clinicians. And then it was really confusing for them, right? It was at the end of the day, I found it was much simpler, just call the guy and talk to them on the phone rather than do all that.
Yeah, they're getting flooded right in a different way than what's hitting them with digital technology.
Yeah,
fantastic.
If it were just one platform, if you only had one platform, all companies had the same platform, right? That would be much simpler. But everyone has a different platform. So.
Absolutely.
Vera, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Stelios. I found that very, very interesting. I'm just curious that when I joined the industry, which is probably around the time you did, companies tended to view other companies as mortal enemies and would avoid sharing anything at all. And that has begun to change in recent years with more collaborative approaches in some therapeutic areas. And I just wonder whether you think that could be another trend, given these increasing barriers, whether you think companies will be more willing to join forces. And if so, is there an opportunity for an independent third party there to mediate these collaborations, do you think?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think it's both at two levels. First of all, you look at oncology, you look at immunology, and the concept of combination treatment. So you have one technology, they have another technology, you need to combine them together. So that's the future. I mean, everyone understands that. And actually, because of the access complexity and the pricing complexity, there is an even bigger need for even bigger alliance teams, etc. But of course, there is only so much you can invest directly on your own resources. So it's more efficient always to work through agencies because you adjust this according to your needs, right? So you don't hire and fire people all the time. So that's one aspect, right? I fully agree with you. This is where science is driving us, right? Collaborations and partnerships. combining therapies and medicines. But also in terms of commercialization, I believe that there is definitely a trend to focus in terms of direct presence, to focus on the, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 big global markets, right? And then the rest of the markets do them through partnerships. And then these partnerships, when you're working through distributors and other companies, there are many challenges and risks you need to mitigate, right? I mean, thinking about compliance, there's a bunch of issues and challenges that you need to manage when you're working through distributors and partners to commercialize the products. And this is where you really need, people like us, businesses, like our businesses, to facilitate this. I was running, a region of distributors, and I did have a small team trying to manage, and it's very complex, and it's a very risky business as well. And we use a lot of agents because there's only so much you can invest, right, in your own team. So I was really always keen to use agents and contractors to really help us deal with the complexity in these markets.
Yeah, and wherever there's challenges, right, there's opportunities for specialized advice and expertise, skill set, which is what obviously we're trying to build at Phraktion. Okay, any further questions? No. Okay, I'll take silence as being not today, but thank you very much, everyone, for your input, and thank you so much, Stelios. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I'm out of my office today, so I've been listening from afar. I'll just make a couple of comments. I mean, there is so much to unpack in this discussion. I'm just kind of soaking it through. A couple comments, maybe just in passing, and we can pick it up at another time. Paul, you asked about structural models and the role of sales versus medical education. I think there will be great pressure on the sales force, and my context, of course, is coming from the US. I think on the medical education side, there's always going to be a compliance barrier, probably, on how high that can go. So I don't know that we'll see huge shifts. What I am seeing is more regional support, coordinated support, account planning teams, or a coordinated project lead that's trying to bring all these different activities together. So that is certainly a dynamic I'm seeing. So that was one thing. I also just will make a passing comment, I guess, on, I think, I can't remember who brought, it might have been Bruce, anyhow, someone made the comment about, bringing products, for example, US to EU. And again, I'm totally speculating here. I don't know the answer to this. I think one of the reasons US companies had hesitancies was the pricing dynamic. And I don't know whether this pricing is going to reduce profitability where it becomes a greater challenge, or where we're going to see growing pricing pressures in the US, it creates more of an opportunity to think about that as a narrowing gap between pricing between countries, because I'm just totally speculating on that. I don't know, but it's just food for thought. So anyhow, I just throwing in a couple of comments, but it's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, absolutely great.
Huge differential in price, Tom. But the weird thing is, when you actually do an analysis, whilst there's normally a 4 to 5-fold price differential between US and EU, when you strike out the middlemen and the rebating, you actually start seeing US prices at net levels that are not so dissimilar to EU prices. So this is all about, the wonderful US system with its layering, and the EU system, which is probably brutally honest in terms of who gets what. But again, what do we book? We book gross, or do we book net? So the US is always Treasure Island, basically, right. And therefore
agreed. I think there is a pricing. There's also a volume dynamic there. And the other comment, I appreciate Stelios's comment on, or the overview of the IRA. That is the Inflation Reduction Act is certainly something I've got to kick the cobwebs. I read it when it came out. I'm just wondering what it means for companies who are looking to develop products in the Medicare space for a population, that's 65 years in age. You think about Parkinson's disease, you think about Alzheimer's, you think about that. I'm just wondering, developmentally, does it make any changes on people? I know right now there's just a lot of gross to net work being done to understand implications, but again, a bit speculative here. I don't have the answer to it, but certainly something a lot of people are trying to get their hands around.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely.
US employees never retire, Tom, so they still get insurance in their 80s.
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions or comments for discussion? Okay. No, I think we've probably we've gone on for 40 minutes, so this has been obviously a very topical subject, and everyone's been really interested, and thank you for taking part. And Stelios, thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Clearly there's a lot of challenges coming to the industry which have already started, and the industry really does need to adapt to that. But I do think that those challenges does present opportunities to us to maybe engage with the industry and to really provide expert advice and support.